The snowstorm hit out of nowhere, like someone just swiped their hand across the sky, tossing a ton of white chaos everywhere. Mallory Holmes was standing by the window in her grandma's old house, staring out into the dark night. She was 14, and winter in the ghost town of Riverfrost felt like straight-up torture. Every year they came here for winter break, but this time it was different. The wind howled louder, the snow piled up thicker, and the nights felt like they'd never end. There were barely any people left in town. Old folks had passed, and the young ones bounced to the big cities. Only a few neighbors still hung around, but even they were nowhere to be seen in weather like this. Grandma always said Riverfrost was cursed. This town was built on lies and fear, she'd say over tea when Mallory was little, and the winters take their toll. Mallory didn't believe it back then, but now, staring at the swirling snowflakes, she felt a chill that wasn't just from the cold. "I'm gonna hit the hay," she said to her grandma, but got no response. The old lady had already gone off to her room. When the clock struck midnight, the lights in the house suddenly went out. Mallory woke up to the silence. It was so absolute, like the snow had wrapped the world in a soundproof blanket. She reached for her phone, but the screen just flashed a dead battery. "Shit," she muttered, and then she heard it. The first sound, a creak, like someone walking across the snow-covered roof. Mallory froze. Her heart was pounding so loud it felt like you could hear it from a mile away. Slowly she sat up in bed, listening. The creak came again, and then another, closer. She carefully got out of bed, tiptoed to the window, pulled the curtain back, and peered outside. Nothing. Just snow. But there was a strange trail leading from the house toward the woods, deep tracks like something heavy had been dragged through the snow. Then she saw it, a dark figure. For a second she thought it was just a trick of the shadows. But no. The figure moved, tall, angular, and what seemed like long limbs. It stood at the edge of the forest, staring right at her. Mallory jumped back from the window, and then, out of nowhere, someone banged on the door. The knocking came again, steady and rhythmic. Boom, boom, boom. Mallory stood in the dark, feeling her heart pounding like it was stuck in her throat. "Grandma?" she called. But all she got in return was silence. She tried to pull herself together. Who could be at the door in this storm? Maybe one of the neighbors, checking if everything was okay. But then, what about the figure by the woods? Boom, boom, boom. "I'm not opening," Mallory yelled, though her voice was shaking. For a moment there was nothing, but then she heard something new. A scratching sound, like someone was dragging their nails across the wooden door. Panic hit her like a wave. She grabbed the flashlight from the shelf, turned it on, and slowly started making her way down the stairs. Downstairs it was freezing, like the wind had snuck inside the house. The beam from the flashlight barely cut through the dark, revealing bits of old furniture, worn-out rugs. But the door was still out of its reach. She took another step, but the flashlight flickered and died. Mallory froze, staring ahead. Snow started trickling in through the crack under the door. She watched as the white flakes settled on the floor. This couldn't be happening. Everything was locked up tight. Then suddenly the snow vanished, like it melted into the air. In its place, black fingers appeared in the gap. Long, thin. They started scratching at the door from the inside, like they were testing its strength. Mallory screamed and bolted backward, but tripped and fell in the dark. She felt her foot hit something hard. The knocking stopped. "Mallory," a voice whispered. It wasn't from outside. It was coming from somewhere behind her, inside the house. She spun around, but instead of a person, she saw a shadow, tall and twisted, like a tree covered in frost. Its edges seemed to tremble, blending more with the dark around it. The shadow stretched out a hand, and there was another ice-cold creak in the house. Mallory tried to scream, but no sound came out. At that moment, Grandma lit a candle at the end of the hall. Her wrinkled face looked as cold as stone, but her eyes were burning with fire. "Get out, you bastard," she shouted, throwing something silver at the shadow. The shadow let out a long, otherworldly screech and dissolved into the air. Grandma hurried over to Mallory, helping her up. "Are you okay?" she asked, gripping her hand tightly. Mallory could barely nod. "What was that?" Grandma looked at her, and in her eyes, Mallory saw pure terror. "The snow guard," she whispered, "and this is just the beginning." Grandma led Mallory into the kitchen, where the dim light of a candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Mallory sat, shivering, wrapped in an old blanket. Grandma was rummaging through one of the drawers, pulling out strange objects. A silver cross, a tiny vial of liquid that looked like mercury, and an old leather book with intricate designs on the cover. "What are you doing?" Mallory whispered, feeling the fear grip her voice. "I'm getting ready," Grandma replied. "For what?" Grandma froze for a second, then turned to Mallory. "To protect us." She opened the book, her shaky fingers flipping through the yellowed pages. "You need to know the truth," Grandma said without looking up. "This town, it's not just cursed. Something was here long before people showed up. The forest's always been alive. And winter." She looked up, her gaze heavy. "Winter here isn't just a season." "But what does that mean?" Mallory asked, trying to understand. Grandma pointed toward the window. "This forest traps souls. Everything that dies here in winter stays buried in its depths. These entities, the Watchers, show up when someone messes with the balance. You saw the tracks. They're trying to take something or someone." Mallory felt her throat tighten. "Someone? Me?" Grandma looked down. "Maybe you. Maybe me. Maybe both of us." Then suddenly there was a new sound. Not knocking this time, but a low hum, like something huge moving through the storm. The windows rattled and the candle flickered on the table. "They're coming back," Grandma whispered. She grabbed the silver cross and the vial, shoving them into Mallory's hands. "We have to go into the forest." "What?" Mallory shook her head. "You said the forest takes souls. If we stay here, they'll take us right out of the house. We don't have a choice." The hum outside grew louder. Mallory could have sworn she saw massive shadows forming outside the windows, their shapes stretching unnaturally, faceless and eerie. Grandma gripped her hand tightly. "Don't let go of me, no matter what you see, and don't listen to them. They'll whisper to you." Together they stepped outside. The cold hit Mallory's face, but worse was what lay ahead. The forest they were heading toward looked even more menacing than before. The closer they got, the louder the hum became. Mallory could feel something invisible shifting around them, and the shadows of the trees seemed to lean toward them. At the edge of the forest, Grandma stopped. She dropped to her knees and started drawing something in the snow, mumbling words Mallory couldn't make out. But before she could finish, the trees came alive. Figures burst out of the woods, tall, ghostly, with eyes burning with an icy light. Their movements were fast, sharp, like gusts of wind tearing through the air. One of them stepped forward, reaching a long arm toward Mallory. She screamed, but Grandma stepped between them, raising the silver cross. "Get back to where you came from," Grandma yelled, her voice echoing through the woods. The figures froze. The air around them began to hum, as if even space itself was freezing. But then one of the shadows spoke. Its voice wasn't human, deep like cracking ice. "You've been here too long. You can't escape." And then, just like that, everything went quiet. The shadows disappeared as suddenly as they'd appeared. Is that it?" Mallory gasped. Grandma looked tired but determined. "No," she said. "They'll be back, and this time we have to be ready." Mallory and her grandma huddled in the house, which now felt like a fragile island amid the raging nightmare outside. The wind howled like the forest itself was speaking to them. Grandma was gathering the remains of silver items, adding strange herbs to a vial, brewing something that looked like a smoking potion. "Listen to me," she said, sitting down across from Mallory. "This forest took my brother, your mom, and a lot of others. It wants me, but now looks like it's after you, too." "Why me?" Mallory's voice trembled. "You're young, strong. Souls like yours feed this forest. You might be what it's been missing." Mallory gripped the cross in her hands. She wasn't just cold from the winter outside. Her grandma's words chilled her to the bone. "What if we run?" Mallory asked. Grandma smiled sadly. "You can't run from the forest. It'll always find you once it's called you." Just then, there was a new sound at the door. This time, it wasn't knocking or humming, but a voice. A woman's voice. Quiet, shaking. "Help. Please let me in." Mallory shot to her feet. Is that a person?" Grandma grabbed her hand. "Number. It's a trap." But the voice called again. "It's so cold out here. I can't. I'm gonna freeze." "It's Lisa," Mallory gasped, recognizing the voice of the neighbor girl. Grandma jumped to her feet and aimed the vial at the door. She muttered something, and the liquid in her hands flared up. In that instant, the voice changed. It dropped low, growling, nothing like a child's. "You won't save her, old witch," it hissed from behind the door. "She's ours now." The house shook. Every window froze over, and the walls began cracking, as if invisible roots were tearing through the house. "They're coming," Grandma whispered. "Now or never." She handed Mallory the book. "You need to finish the ritual, find the last page, and read the words." "And you?" Grandma hugged her tight, whispering something quickly in her ear. Then she stepped toward the door, clutching the burning vial. "I've got my own business with this forest," she said. The door slammed open, and Grandma stepped into the night. Outside, Mallory could hear icy growls and the sound of the earth cracking, like it was trying to swallow her. Mallory opened the book. The pages were shaking in her hands, the text shimmering like it was written in frost. She found the last page, where the words began glowing with a faint blue light. "Domus frigus, relinque nos." She started reading, trying to shout over the noise. Suddenly, something slammed against the window. A massive face made of shadows and snow pressed up against the glass, its icy eyes staring right at her. "You won't save her," it whispered. "She's already dead." But Mallory kept going. The blue light grew brighter, flooding the room. The house creaked like it was coming alive. Outside, the final deafening howl rang out, and then everything went silent. When Mallory came to, she was alone. The snow outside no longer seemed ominous, and the forest looked calm. But Grandma didn't come back.